I started enjoying art at a very young age, maybe 5 or 6. And when I was in grade school, I know I participated in any kind of art that there was. My parents recognized this in me, and they got me private teachers. Usually it was a middle-aged or older woman, and you went to their house and they kind of taught you what they knew. Sometimes that worked real good for me, although I can remember one of the ladies was teaching me how to use pastels, and all she wanted me to do was copy pictures in a book. And I didn't like that. I didn't want to copy other people's pictures. I wanted to do my own. I had an unusual experience with one of those private teachers, which I didn't realize how important it was until later. I went to the classroom, which in this particular case was downtown. And when I got there, there was a gentleman there. And apparently he was interested in how she goes about teaching. He knew her. And so he stuck around for a little while. He didn't talk to me much, but he watched. And then he left before the class was over, and I didn't think about it. But now, after I remember the name that she gave me after he left, it was Black Bear Boson. And just the fact that at some point in my tiny life at that point, I got to meet such an incredible man was something I've enjoyed since then. It was hard, you know, to always find a private teacher or something, and there wasn't that much taught in grade school. But what I was fascinated with horses. I always wanted to be around horses, and when I went to my uncle's farm down in Oklahoma or something and got to ride the horse, I was in heaven. So I thought, well, let's learn to draw horses. Well, back in those days, there was a series of books on how to draw, and they were a big book, a paper book, and it had instructions on how to use guides and start and draw the horses. So I bought one of those books. I had to save my pennies, but I bought the book. And I drew out of that book. I drew horses and horses and horses, and I still draw horses to this day. I love doing it. I did finally get to take care of some horses and ride them and play with them and stuff. But so that was when I knew drawing was what really was my ticket. So I'd studied ink, I'd studied the pastels, I studied a little bit of watercolor. In high school, I took a couple of classes which were okay, but they didn't really push my buttons. Also, when I was in high school at that point, I began to get real interested in math and science. I took virtually every math course they offered and every science class I could get that had to do with biology at any level. So I started to walk away from the art when I was in high school. I didn't come back to art really even when I was in college. My first college class was when I was 17 years old, 8 o'clock Monday morning, University of Wichita, and it was art history class. And I thought that was pretty cool. That was interesting to realize that people have been doing this art for centuries. So I enjoyed that, and I did take 1 or 2 art classes at university, but not much, because my interest at that point was all science and math. I didn't get back to really doing art until more recently. And I moved back to Wichita and managed to become healthy enough that I could get out and socialize. I started looking into arts, and I found out about the Kansas Art Guild, and I started going to the meetings. And I met a wonderful man there who encouraged me. And I joined that group, and I started doing drawing again, and he kept encouraging me, and I ended up being the president of that organization for a couple of years.
Wow.
He was also the one that started Meade Street Gallery downtown in Old Town. And he invited me to join that, and it was a co-op of artists that worked there. And I met some incredible people there, and they would invite in other artists, and we've had some very well-known local artists there. We had that for 15 years. It was closed in December of 18. I got started doing my critters at some point while I was there. I did other things. I did acrylic landscapes, I did alcohol ink. I tried to learn all kinds of new things. But my love of drawing kept going back to the animals. I drew birds and cats and you name it. Horses too.
Yeah.
And I found that the critters were causing some good reactions from people sometimes. So I kept doing them because I was enjoying them. And then I started having them copyrighted as books. That's what I could afford.
Yeah.
If I put 50 or 100 of them in a book, I could copyright the entire book. And that had them covered.
Yeah.
Legally.
Yeah.
I now have 500 critters under copyright protection.
Yeah.
But then I met a lady, her name was Pamela Cannon, and she worked as a teacher over in Butler County in helping people who'd had to drop out of high school get back into the learning process. And after she and her husband had come by the gallery one time and seen my things, she talked to me about using them to encourage people to read and write. So we played with that idea, and I ended up doing projects with her. It was a very simple idea on my part. If you present a critter as a student that's trying to get back, you look at that critter and you tell me about it. You describe it, what you see and what you think it does. And this never ended up going very far. We tried it on a couple of groups, and it never went very far because the instructors who would listen to our presentation didn't understand. It wasn't normal, so they weren't put it in. But Miss Cannon loved this idea, and it was another expansion of the critters into a different area. That's one of the things I love the most, is when they can influence to help people. So we did that, and like I said, we closed the gallery in December of 18, and since then I have not done much of anything with the art. There really wasn't any way to do it. I don't do things online. My only other exposure had been through a company called Alban Lake, and they are located in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And I'd taken my critters to a comic book convention here in Wichita, and he had seen them there and got interested. He published a coloring book and a calendar in 2015, and they sold a few. But unfortunately, he passed away, and I haven't had connections with that company since then. That's the only time they've been commercially available, other than right here. When I first started doing critters, what I would often do is draw something that's fairly familiar, like a lizard or a turtle or a bird or something, and then try and make it wild. But I found that boring very, very quickly because I was starting with lizards, turtles, and birds. So what I did was I started looking around where I was working. I had a drafting table. I had a whole setup for my work area in my studio. And I would look around, and one of our people in there was a weaver. So she had racks of yarn. Well, yarn comes in all kinds of shapes and stuff, as well as her looms. So I would draw a shape on a paper and just start playing with it. And at first, that just really didn't go anywhere. But I kept playing with the idea, and I kept thinking, well, what are some other shapes? I've got one. I should have gotten him out. He's called Maplid. And Maplid has maple seeds for his head. So once I got those on, I could develop the critter. Not trying to plan it, just draw. When I watched how people reacted to these, I noticed that they always reacted best if they could see something with eyes.
Mm.
So at first everything has 2 eyes and you can see them. Now I changed that little pattern after a while.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it really is easier for people to make a point of this being an animal rather than just a shape or a blob of something if they can see eyes. I soon learned that. Once I started doing that, it took off like a shot. I couldn't quit and go home in the evening sometimes because I was creating so fast. The creating of them then led to how do I present them. I very quickly had learned to use the ink, and I found I was very good with the ink. I could get the kinds of line, shape, texturing, and everything that I wanted as I went, and at the same time, because ink is always a little variable, it would add to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how the Kritters started. That was hard. Some of them, like the one I told you about, Maplet, the name comes pretty close to what you think. I tried to avoid human names, although I have named a few of them. There's Robert and Rebecca Rootworm come to mind. But I didn't want somebody, to name something Bobby Joe and some Bobby Joe going, well, that's not me, kind of thing. So I avoided human names. And in a lot of cases, I would just write 3 letters on the paper and see if it developed. Sometimes the image itself kind of suggested some ideas. Yeah, I've got 500 names, so that was a trick.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just had to work at it, like this critter here. His name's Tramden. Why? Okay, so did you talk to me, sir? No. The problem was once I get a black and white drawing and it's in ink and I'm happy with it, then I have to take a process to get it into color. And for that, I usually have the black and white image transferred to some kind of paper that I can work on with markers or with colored pencils. I love working with colored pencils. I also work with markers and sometimes with watercolors with them in a way that I allow the colors to develop just the same way I did the image initially. Once it gets to that point, and sometimes I have to do 3 or 4 of them that way before I'm happy with it, then it can go on and be ready for presentation. For me personally, it's just enjoying what I'm doing. If I had a goal just for the Kritters, it would be to find a partner who could help me get these out to the public in a way that the public could enjoy, like with coloring books or that kind of thing. I'm not able to do that kind of thing. I would very much like to find someone to partner with about that kind of thing. But for me, at the same time, my goal is to be able to just to present it in a way that people can experience it. I don't need inspiration. I just sit down and draw. And like I said, I just put a shape on the paper and I look at the shape and say, okay, let's add to it this way. Let's tuck it in here. It's got something going that way. That's all there is to it.
Awesome.
I'm not sure it has in a reality way. My background in science and getting my college degrees and everything were so demanding that I didn't participate or think about it. And as I developed the Kritters, I really wasn't thinking about the biology. That didn't happen until I got together with Pamela and we started to think about making people think about it. So at first I would say not much. Did my background in science evolve into Kritters in any way? Well, I'd always had, I had a love of horses, and we always had dogs and cats in our household, so being around the normal kind of animals was the way I grew up. I really didn't know about studying animals too much until I got then at the University of Wichita and took my first biology class. And the fact that animals could not only be described by biology, but they could be studied for the science of it intrigued me. And that's probably why I kept going with that. I did that at several different levels. There was a very well-known geology teacher at the University of Wichita back in those days. He was known in the fossil world as the work he'd done. And he gave me fossils to work with. And when I told him I was going to go on and get my master's degree and study mammals, he was upset because he wanted me doing fossils. And I did work on one large fossil for them. I think what happened is I started studying the biology and realizing all of that. I was blown away by the variety of life that goes beyond anything we would have seen in Wichita, and I just was intrigued with wanting to know more and more and more and more. When I got my master's degree, I got that on the social behavior of lactating dairy cows. I followed a herd of 70 head of mixed breed cows for 4 months and wrote them up. Who's social to who? That was my thesis.
Wow.
Social behavior of lactating dairy cows.
Wow.
So by having the direct one-on-one relationship with the cattle and with other animals that I had dealt with at the University of Wichita, I knew I was so attracted to that. That's where I wanted to go. When I got my master's degree and found out that this job was available at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History, I grabbed it. The man that I worked under was Dr. Charles O. Hanley Jr. Dr. Hanley was very well known in the field. He was the head of the department. And he put me to work first on the mammals of Panama. And I worked on that for a year. I can tell you some funny stories about that too. Then when the grant for that was ending, he moved me over to the Venezuela things. My work on that field was to not only identify things, but what had happened was the collection of the animals had all happened short years before. There were 55,000 specimens collected from Venezuela, all highly organized, and we had the specimens there. With a small mammal specimen, you have the skin and you have the skull. And that's the only parts you're going to be able to determine what they are. What they had done though was when they were out in the field and they went and got in a net and got a bunch of bats out, for each animal they wrote down where it was, and they knew then that computer cards had 80 columns and 10 choices per column. So they defined these columns for different things, and then you picked the point on the column that fit that animal. Well, when they got these back to DC and when they got presented to me, they didn't have any way of getting that into a computer because there wasn't anything to read them. They didn't have scanners like they do now. So my job was to translate this information into a code that would save that data on those 55,000 animals.
Wow.
And that's what I did.
Wow.
When we got that data put in the computer, then they could start writing papers based on the information going back and forth. I worked with scientists from New York to Michigan to one was in Utah. They were all amazed that we managed to save that, because when they got home from doing the collecting out in the field, they thought they'd lost the data. It would never be usable. And that work for me was paid for by a U.S. Army grant. Well, depending on how you want to define art, to me, creativity is the process that may save mankind from mankind's himself. If we're not creative, if we quit creating, we are doomed. We are doomed as a species, and we will doom the planet. So you have to be able to create, whether it's with drawing with a pencil, with paint, with developing a new dress, developing a new house, developing new ideas. Art can lead to the expansion of your brain and your ability to create. And creating is essential, absolutely essential to human existence. Be willing to learn anything about art, technique, media, surface, anything. Be willing to learn anything. Don't prejudge that it's worthwhile or not. You can make that judgment later. At the same time, expect yourself to be honest about what you're doing within yourself, but you want to do it while you're having fun, while you're enjoying what you're doing. And even if something is difficult, you can't quite figure out where to make that line go or that shape go, or I didn't do that quite. Don't get down on yourself, just keep trying. Keep trying, keep learning. And it's so much fun.